Hello and welcome. We're going to be talking about Greek philosophy in this section, and we're going to be talking a summation of Greek philosophy, and we're going to have a few details, but it's kind of an overview. We're not going to get in depth into each of these philosophies that I will save for your philosophy courses. And so we're going to be talking about Greek philosophy, and there are three different sections. There's the pre-Socratic philosophers, or the Ionian philosophers is what they're also known as. You have the classical Greek philosophers such as Plato and Socrates, and then there's the Hellenistic philosophers. So first we're going to be looking at the Ionian rationalists, or the pre-Socratic philosophers. So it's important to note that Ionian rationalists deal with the nature of the world. So in Greece, at this time, there emerged an inventive philosophers who'd, rather than being concerned with how society is organized, focused on explaining why the natural world is what it is. And today these are known as Ionian rationalists. These thinkers are called rationalists because they were the first people to look for logical versus mythological explanations of natural phenomena. What we would classify as science or scientific philosophy. They were very radical at their time, and they were viewed by much of Greeks as being sacrilegious because they were going against the mythologies of the age. They were inquiries of man that led a number of different directions. They concentrated on explaining the natural world because they were they were particularly interested in measurements and standards and mathematics and geometry, and they were while others were focused more on abstract concerns such as what is fun. So the political life of the Ionians was very volatile. There were territorial clashes both between the Greeks and the Persians. There was fractionalism, there were civil wars, and class strife that was run. So the Ionian rationalists emerged out of this chaotic political context and was like, what is more important? They wanted to know what is making up of this. And this first begins with Thales of Miletus, who is the first Ionian rationalist and is commonly known as the first philosopher. He was a merchant who traveled to Egypt, and he was probably exposed to Egyptian culture as well as Chaldean mathematics and astronomy. And one of Thales' most famous achievements was he was able to predict a total solar eclipse of the sun in 585 BCE. And this was his biggest contribution. However, simply asking the question is, what is the world made of? What is the basic unit that composes of all life and all things? Thales argues that the antecedent of all living things was the first element, which is water. He believes because everything was being nourished of water. In fact, his belief of how the earth worked was that the earth was a flat body that was floating on top of water as if it was a raft. Thales moves away from that traditional pagan concept of gods, and he believes that a god or a divine creature created everything, that people possess souls that were linked to other souls, and that all beings were related to one another. One of Thales' students is the Anaximander, who expanded on his teaching theories. But Anaximander was the first individual who had a map of the world. He believed that the earth was originally covered by water, but it had dried up from the sun, and therefore humankind was kind of descended from fish-like creatures. And he gets this because in the mountains there were fossils of fish, and he really believes that this is a kind of how the world is actually not really linked from water, but more from the sun and from the sun drying up the water. Now, the poet Xenophon, he was challenged by conventional notions of anthropomorphic gods, Greek gods. Um, and what he says is they're not anthropomorphic, that they're actually egotistical. Instead, he proposed that it was a divine being who had all sight, all mind, and all hearing, who remained unmoved by all things by thought. Xenophon also believed that the worlds experience alternative cycles, so that it would be dry or it would be covered in water, and this was kind of cyclical. And again, this is from fossils of fish that is found in mountain ranges. And when it came to the prime element, Xenophon leans towards the earth, as the earth is the prime element, and that was the whole goal, is to try to find the prime element. One of the most colorful figures of Ionian rationalism was Pythagoras, and he called himself a lover of wisdom, hence philosophe, or philosopher is where we get the term from. He's allegedly traveled really widely and picked up different elements from Eastern thinking. We don't know that for sure. Pythagoras' ideas fall into a category of mathematics and mysticism. Although he did not believe, he didn't see things as different, what he does is he comes up with the cornerstones of geometry, and including the Pythagorean theorem that is named after him, and the thought that the first element was in fact number. Pythagoras made important advancements in astronomy and regarding the movements of the planets. He believed that the universe was put together by mathematical precise lines, and that these mathematical lines and music were interrelated. Pythagoras was both a mathematician and a mystic, and also a musician. It's really interesting to note. So those are the three Ionian philosophers. Another we're going to be looking at is not only philosophy, but we're going to be moving on to the second wave of philosophy. And so this is the wave after the Ionian rationalists. And we're going to concentrate on the second group of philosophers, who were known as the sophists. And the sophists were people who focused on the internal world of the human mind. And one of the sophists, sophists tend to earn livings by teaching. They teaching debate skills to young Athenian youths, and other states, but they primarily focused on Athens, whose government really encouraged. Remember, we talked about encouraged people to speak at public assemblies, and so oratory skills became very popular and led to more power. So of course you wanted your sons to be educated in the ways of great orators and of debate. These teachings that they taught made them very, very unpopular. Because if you're teaching people to debate and you're teaching to question everything, that the more traditional and conservative mindset of people tend to be very angry at this. Critics viewed the sophists as parasites, as tricksters, as people who are amoral and didn't have moral centers. The rhetorical teachings that they did was for the argument for sake of argument, and that was seen as great trickery. And so it didn't really help their reputation. It ends up being the death of one of them, who we're going to be talking about. A good example of this is with Gorgias. And he demonstrated that lengthy and complex logical arguments, that this was not possible to prove anything really existed at all. In fact, if anything did exist, we couldn't properly comprehend it or understand it. And so communication about our knowledge is like, what is our knowledge? It was very abstract thinking. And to the average person, the sophist abstract theorizing seemed neither comprehensible nor particularly helpful. And segments of the populace really thought that they were just they were educating a whole bunch of idle youth who could be doing far more with their lives. Often what a lot of people think about college. So we're going to be focusing First on Socrates, and then we're going to talk about Plato, and then we're going to talk about what happened to Socrates next. So Socrates and the internal questioning. So in the 5th century, Athens was boasted Socrates as one of the greatest thinkers of all times. Now it's important to note Socrates never accepted money from students, and this will come back and play in just a moment. And he really didn't classify himself as a teacher. He wrote nothing of his works, and what we know about Socrates is primarily from Plato. Socrates viewed himself as divinely sanctioned quest for knowledge, and is famous for developing the methodology of inquiry, entirely composed of asking questions. And this is known as the Socratic method. So the Socratic method is he'd start by posing a very innocent question to a supposedly wise man. And then he'd keep asking the question until the wise man, re-evaluated his assumptions, and he became trapped in a maze of contradictions. And so this showed that he was in fact ignorant, and this was not very popular at the time. Socrates' form of instruction was based on questions, not giving answer, and forcing people to reach their own conclusions and rethinking their convictions. It made him very unpopular by a lot of people. He was seen as being very eccentric. For example, one of his eccentricities is he liked to be very unpredictable. And one such event happened is he was at a party, and at these parties they tend to have naked young men who are in great shape would dance and play music, and all the people at the party would watch. Well, in the midst of some of these young men who were performing, Socrates strips naked, and he is much older at this point and very out of shape, and begins dancing with the youth. And everyone is horrified. And they're like, they don't want to see this old man who's out of shape dancing. And so what they say to him is, they're like, why are you doing this? And you're out of shape. You're not beautiful. Remember, beauty of the male body is the perfect male body, to the Athenians. And Socrates replies, well, how am I else supposed to get in shape? This is a great form of exercise. So he wasn't very popular at parties as well. And so Socrates not only did questions to fuel his philosophies, but he also used analogies to make his argument and make it harder for others to grasp difficult concepts. And Socrates is regarded to this day as one of the greatest Western thinkers of all time. So his main legacy is marked by Socrates is that actually his student Plato. So Plato wrote a great deal, and we have a lot of his works. Some of the works aren't composed, and his works are profoundly influential in Western philosophy. Plato developed an influential and distinctive view of existence. We have a lot of writings of him. At one point, he's writing very much from Socrates' point of view, and then he writes kind of his own, and there's an intermixing of that, and then there's some that we're not quite sure if they actually belong to Plato, that are associated with Plato, but there's a lot of works that we have. So Plato postulated that the world we perceive with our senses is not reality. There is a second world, of perfect forms that can only be reached with pure thought. And all these senses of the world are pale, imperfect shadows of the ideal. Like, remember when I brought up how Plato actually likes Egyptian art because it doesn't look like real people, where Grecian art tends to be too perfect looking, and so it's kind of a fallacy. He would definitely hate television right now, or photography of any means. Plato's ideas stressed order and unity, and his rather totalitarian image of an ideal state. He represents a turn away from experimentation of natural science of the Ionians and turns towards a purely abstract thought. In Plato's Republic, for example, he gives us the four, what is known now as the Platonic virtues, which are wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice. And these eternal truths that he's looking for in the existence of what is the idea or the ideals. Rather than what you would call natural or physical worth, he's looking for the ideal. Internal truths that can exist with only within your mind but can't be observed or perceived out in the physical world. And he's really he says the physical world is too much, and that instead it doesn't give you truth. It's just because our senses, our sights, our sound is very different. We don't all know that's going on. Plato calls this not truth. That the world, the physical world, is not sensible. It is perceived by senses. So our knowledge is divided from which we gain through sensibility knowledge, that I can see this, I can hear this, and what I intellectually know, what our intelligence knows, is the realms of ideas, the I think. In Plato's hierarchy, sensibility and sensory knowledge is at fault and is and merely a shadow or representation of the true knowledge. And this is exactly what the allegory of the cave is, which I assigned you to read. And is what he's saying is that the physical world, that world that is beyond, is not as good as truth and shadows. This reality of the reality is outside the cave, but is that really reality when it's the sun who's performing the shadows? And Plato's proof is through mathematical formulas, and he creates a lot of mathematical formulas of rational, logical thinking. Philosophy is the better means of finding truth through the physical world. Same goes for everything with truth, virtue, love, beauty must be the ideal, the unchanging, the eternal form. And there must be an internal form of love. An external form of love that expresses all love, the archetype of beauty that expresses all beauty. And so that every form found on earth, such as triangles and circles and humans and birds and virtue and love, there is a corresponding truth that exists in a higher plane and higher idealism. In the realm of true ideals versus idealism. It's very messy, but that's what Plato believes. So what we know a lot about Socrates is through Plato. And for example, we're going to be talking about the trial of Socrates and why that's vitally important. And it ends up bringing the age to the classical age of Greece to its end. Is one of that and the Peloponnesian War that goes on at the same time. So like I said, the 5th century, it starts out very high in charge of thought and ideals, and by the end of the 5th century is kind of this shameful act of the death of Socrates and the chaos that ensues from the Peloponnesian War is kind of the death of the classical age. So what happens in 399 BCE, Socrates was formally put on trial at Athens for 2 charges, impiety and the corruption of youth. So the Athenian trial system is a little different. So out of this, you get 501 citizens who are chosen at random. And what happens in this trial is that the prosecution would make a speech and then the defense would make a speech. And after hearing both speeches, the members of the jury would vote guilty or innocent. Okay. So our knowledge of what happens at this trial comes from mainly the accounts of Plato, known as the Apology. We don't actually have the Apology is Socrates' speech, but we don't have the prosecution speech. Instead, we can kind of glean what they kind of said by the responses of Socrates. So what happens is that earlier, Athens had passed a law that made it illegal to deny the existence of the gods or teach new explanations of this natural phenomenon. Now, Socrates never said he was against the gods by any means. What he did do is by posing questions and understanding different natural phenomenon, how his philosophy worked, he said that he wasn't teaching the traditional means of the existence of the gods, which it was illegal. Okay, and this happened well before. And he said, look, and the fact that he toyed with the with the gods is what they're saying. They also said he was corrupting the youth. Now Socrates says, "Look, I have never denied the gods. I'm actually a very good Athenian." And on top of that, what he says is, in fact, that he is not a teacher. He never received money for teaching philosophy. Instead, like he wasn't even in control of all these students that are following him. In fact, he says, "Look, it's a free country. Youth follow me all the time. I don't know why they're doing it. They just do it. And so I'm not a teacher." And he prominently says, "I'm not a teacher." And he probably would have influenced more of the jury. He was a very prominent man, and the trial was, towards the end of, the trial was towards the end of the Peloponnesian War, and so people were more conservative. And what ends up happening is that by a very slim margin, less than 6%, Socrates is found guilty. Now, the Athenian legal procedures, what happens is the second phase of the jury system. So once found guilty and only found guilty, what happens is that the prosecution could say a punishment, the defense could claim an alternative punishment, and then the 501 jurors would vote for which of the two. Now, what happens is the prosecution proposes the death penalty, which everyone thought was going to happen. And Socrates what he proposes, in fact, ultimately is kind of an act of suicide in the long run. So what he says is that actually I am not, he claims that, look, he gets down there and he says, "Look, I shouldn't be punished. In fact, I should be glorified above all other Athenians. I should have free meals and free dinners for the rest of my life at the state expense," which was the greatest award a citizen could get from Athens. Because he says, "Look, I am a true Athenian. I have fought in the wars. I have said all these things. I am bringing up Athens." Well, this upsets the jury, and he is found overwhelmingly in favor for the death penalty. Now, no one actually thought he was going to take the death penalty. People were given the death sentence all the time, but what they would do is they would escape in the middle of the night, go into exile, and flee. Everyone thought that Socrates was going to do this. In fact, his friends gather, they go to the prison, they try to get him out, and he says, "No, I refuse to go." Instead, he says, "I'm obeying Athenian law as an Athenian citizen. Therefore, I should not, I will not go. I should not run and flee because I am a true Athenian, the most righteous Athenian citizen." And so what ends up happening is the jailer presents him with a cup of hemlock, and he willingly drinks it, and dies. And this is kind of the unconventional way of the death of the Greek Golden Age. But this, coupled with the Peloponnesian War, which we'll talk in a little bit about, is really the end of the classical Greek phase, and because chaos ensues right after. So in this chaos, what ends up happening is during the Hellenistic period, Hellenistic philosophy comes about. And this is predominantly done by Stoicism and Epicureanism. Now, these are known as therapeutic philosophies that make you feel better. The people in the world have value. The world has failed, and these values are going to make you feel better. The polis is gone. It's an impersonal government. There's a lot of counts of alienation of the common good. So philosophers shift to ethics. Like, how can I cope? How can I live in this period? And that seems to be more important than what the world was made of to this age group of philosophers, or how we should think or view the world, or seeking of truth. And so what ends up happening is Stoicism comes about with Zeno, Zeno, and who taught at the Stola Poikile, which is pretty much an outdoor painted pose. And so it's really, this philosophy is called Porchism, technically. Stoicism literally means the porchism. And he follows in the steps of Plato and Aristotle, who we didn't talk about. Aristotle is also in the Golden Age as well. And what he does is he says knowledge could be equated with virtue, and Zeno believes that a divine reasoning that permeated all creation. So at point, purpose, and laws behind everything. Virtue consisted of becoming equated with divine reasoning and accepting your positions. For example, the Stoic says, "We are all in a theater. We must play the roles we were meant to play." So you should be happy with what you're at. Over time, natural law and moral duty and stuff will come into understanding. But if really it's, I understand the law of nature and I live within them and I am happy. So if I'm happy, I am not stressed. Pain and stress, that is, any individual in societies are a result of misunderstanding and possessing enough knowledge. But pain and stress are destructive. Not final, just destructive. Death is only natural and shouldn't be feared but embraced. So the Stoics really believe, they think of like apathy of Stoic stage, that apathy does not mean that you do not care, but you are beyond all pain. That's what they're pretty much saying. And understanding how the world works is understanding it. Like your place in society, you should just be happy with it. And so for Stoics, suicide is acceptable. If you're not happy, the pain is too great, escape, be happy. So everyone is considered equal and fundamentally alike to the Stoics, and their whole goal is however you're brought into the world, you play your part, you sing the stage you sing the tune you're supposed to be on, you play on the stage you're supposed to be on, and you should be happy and not stressed and not worried about the outcome. Epicureanism derives from Epicurus, who also taught in Athens, and Epicurus was less influential than the Stoics, than Stoicism, and they have it's very careful not to imagine Epicureanism in itself as being a caricature. It's not really. So Epicureanism is the aim of philosophy is happiness or pleasure. So this is what Aristotle said: the point of living is to be happy. But that doesn't mean that hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure or sexual self-indulgence. Instead, Epicureanism is the phrase that we today equate with eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. Epicureanism defined happiness as being as an absence of pain from the body and the trouble from the soul. And in Epicureanism, the philosophy is that the pleasure is too extreme. You must withdraw from the world, remove the stress of life and anguish. Don't eat too much food. Don't make too much love. Don't have too much stress. Don't drink too much. And Epicureanism desire is pretty much moderation. And they really say moderation, it will bring happiness. The only things that are attainable is through moderation. The Romans are greatly influenced by Stoicism, not as much as Epicureanism, but Stoicism is very much what the Roman philosophy developed, that pursuit of happiness, to reducing of stress, to making sure that your lot in life is good. If you're a slave, you remain a slave. If you're a woman in the household, you're going to remain a woman in that household, and you shouldn't go for grander things because you're going to just make yourself unhappy. So this is kind of, Stoicism is on the foundation in which Rome is kind of based on the conquest of the Hellenistic world and its culture. And a lot of Roman philosophy is directly a result of Stoicism. And so all roads lead to Rome is a very accurate setting with this, with Greek philosophy in many ways. I hope you enjoyed Greek philosophy.